Greetings and salutations, Geo Nerds. Here we are today on Lawnton Station. I lived out here a lot of my life, and there's the Nambour Express going through. Look at that. Get out of the way here. That's not going to stop. I love these new trains. I like the fact that they're nearly the same height as the platforms, sort of. Anyway, Lawnton Flour Mill. Didn't know anything about it. Let's have a look at it. Well, folks, what are we talking about today? Well, this is the Paisley Cornflour Mill at Lawnton. This thing was there for 90 years, from the late 1800s right through to the 1960s, just over the road from the school. My wife went to that school. She knew nothing about this. So the Francis family, a la Francis Road, etc., owned most of what is now Lawnton at one stage. So let's have a look at where this is. So we're looking down, you can see the school there, the high school there on the right, the state school at the back there where it is now. And this is the area where the flour mill was. This whole area. I lived there very close to that. I never knew anything about it. Crazy. Did judo there when I was a kid. Never knew anything about it. Amazing. Anyway, this is at 1949. Still see the Spitfire Avenue airstrip is there, Bell's Pocket Road, and there's our mill right there. This is in 1951. It's quite a better photo. Still see the airfield there, and there's the mill. There it is. School's not built yet, but the mill's there. Amazing. The railway line's there too, if you have a look. Anyway, this is cornflour. I shouldn't have to. It's cornflour, all right? It is cornflour, trust me. Anyway. Cornflour isn't cornflour because corn is not maize. Corn is any edible grain. It can be maize, of course, which is this good stuff here. Goodish. If you're an American Indian, you can digest the stuff properly. It can be sorghum, which is this stuff here. It can also be called milo, but the same grain. It can even be wheat. You can make cornflour from wheat and cornflour as they call it. And in this case, they used to make them out of these things. A few French fries there, eh? Potatoes. And it can also be made out of this wonderful stuff, rice. So, yeah, it's quite a bit. And of course, the Paisley cornflour was the best quality. Absolutely pure, because it was made out of pure water from 4 Mile Creek. But hey, don't take my word for it. I'm going to play you a clip from a guy called Brian Francis, who unfortunately is no longer with us. He died in 2013. Now, this mill operated until May 1966. And Brian lived there for most of his life working there. So here's Mr. Brian Francis, and in his own words.
Hello, I'm Brian William Francis. I was born on the 4th of November 1936 at Lawnton and lived most of my early days, or all my early days, in Lawnton, in the area where the Paisley Cornflour Mill used to exist. The family came to the area in the very, very early days of settlement at Lawnton and Pine Rivers. Walter Francis was the original one from the family. I'm not sure the exact date he came to Brisbane, but I am given to understand that he actually came out to Brisbane and built a sugar mill in the St Lucia area, and they crushed sugar from the St Lucia area. The St Lucia area wasn't suitable for growing of sugar, and at some stage he then went looking to build a cornflour mill for himself. He found the waters of the 4 Mile Creek in the Pine Rivers area to be the most pure waters in the Brisbane area, and so he decided to build his cornflour mill there, because cornflour milling from maize is a wet process, and the water content is very, very important as to the yield that you get. So he built his corn flour mill there. I believe when he first built it, he did some experimenting with milling cassava, and there were difficulties in doing that, so that didn't go ahead. But he did continue to use maize to make his maize corn flour. The word corn flour being corn is any cereal grain, so therefore corn flour can be made from any cereal grain. In the early days, the main ones were maize as corn, rice and potato were the derivatives for manufacturing corn flour. And in later days then they started making corn flour from wheat and flour. However, we didn't do that, and we used corn, which, as I said before, was a wet process.
Well folks, that's it for this video. Don't forget, if you like this, like, subscribe, notifications, all that stuff. I don't put the icons up anymore. You get too much of it. If you've got a friend you think might like this content, please tell them about it. Link down below if you want to buy me a coffee. Appreciate all those who have. Something interesting coming next. We're going to finish off Cabbage Stew Creek. Yeah, maybe. We'll see. Anyway, you know what I'm going to say. Keep rocking. T-Rock's out. Bit of an unusual ending, this one, folks. At the end of this video, I'm going to put the whole 35 minutes of the Brian Francis interview. This is from the Pine Rivers Shire. As said, he's no longer with us. It's his life. It's well worth listening to, but I understand it's fairly long. Anyway, keep rocking again. You know the story. T-Rock's out.
Hello, I'm Brian William Francis. I was born on the 4th of November 1936 at Lawnton and lived most of my early days, or all my early days, in Lawnton, in the area where the Paisley cornflour mill used to exist. The family came to the area in the very early days of settlement at Lawnton and Pine Rivers. Walter Francis was the original one from the family. I'm not sure the exact date he came to Brisbane, but I am given to understand that he actually came out to Brisbane and built a sugar mill in the St Lucia area, and they crushed sugar from the St Lucia area. The St Lucia area wasn't suitable for growing of sugar, and at some stage he then went looking to build a cornflour mill for himself. He found the waters of the 4 Mile Creek in the Pine Rivers area to be the most pure waters in the Brisbane area, and so he decided to build his cornflour mill there, because cornflour milling from maize is a wet process, and the water content is very, very important as to the yield that you get. So he built his cornflour mill there. I believe when he first built it, he did some experimenting with milling cassava, and there were difficulties in doing that, so that didn't go ahead. But he did continue to use maize to make his maize corn flour. The word corn flour being corn is any cereal grain, so therefore corn flour can be made from any cereal grain. In the early days, the main ones were maize as corn, rice and potato were the derivatives for manufacturing corn flour. And in later days then they started making corn flour from wheat and flour. However, we didn't do that, and we used corn, which, as I said before, was a wet process. But going back to that early days, I believe that Walter actually purchased the land from the 4 Mile Creek Bridge to the North Pine River. He later sold to the Brays the area that they have, and then of course in later years again the area of the swimming pool was resumed by the council. Before that, incidentally, the Lawnton Showgrounds, the area of that was donated by the family for showground purposes. The early family the industry was an important part of the area. The cornflour mill being the centre industry shared with the rum distillery in the area, and we employed a lot of local people over the time. They initially drew their corn from the local area, grown locally, but as things developed and transport got cheaper, it was feasible then to bring corn from the Kingaroy Downs, the east of the Great Divide area there, and also from Atherton Tableland at times, and that used to keep our corn supply going in the early days. In my early childhood, I can remember I was brought up in the cornflour mill, and I spent lots of time at the cornflour mill looking at how it was all done, and Dad would talk to me about the improvements that he was going to make and things like that. And I can remember distinctly one of the things was that if I'd been particularly good as a child, I was allowed to get up at 2 o'clock in the morning with my dad, because that's when he used to go to start the mill up. I would go to the mill and I'd actually go around with Dad as he started the process going at 2 o'clock, because he used to do that by himself. And then if I was still very good, I was allowed to sleep in an empty corn bag, and that was a very, very big privilege. One corn bag would be rolled up as a pillow, and I'd hop inside another corn bag and then sleep while on the floor of the cornflour mill while he went about the manufacturing process. The only reason he could do the manufacturing process by himself was that it took some time from when he first started to get the mill going until when finished product was coming off the end, where you needed more people to process it. And so he would work until about 8 o'clock in the morning. By that time, a lot of others started at 7, and they would then take over from him. He'd go home for breakfast, or breakfast was brought to him because he lived quite close handy to the mill. It was only a hop, step and a jump away. But that was a very very fixed thing in my mind. I can remember that when it was great days, and the cornflour mill became part of my blood, and you lived to be in the days when you worked in the cornflour mill. I used to work when I went to school. I used to work of a Saturday morning, and I used to get pocket money for actually emptying the bags of corn into the hopper, which used to then go through a cleaning process to take any impediments out of the corn. And when you got your corn from the Kingaroy district, there was always a bonus, because the bags had often been used to transport peanuts, and the cleaning machine would extract the peanuts to one side, so you would have a free feed of peanuts, nice fresh ones, and after you'd emptied all the corn into these big vats. The vats were used to soak the corn, or steeping as the official word is called, and it was heated water, not boiling, but it was heated, and there were chemicals added to the water to help hydrate and break down the gluten particles, so you could separate the gluten from the starch. And that was a very, very important part of the process. You would Saturday morning you would actually fill the vat with corn, and 2 o'clock Monday morning you'd start milling it. So it was left to soak for that amount of time, as I said, at an increased temperature. At that time, the water was drained off, and in the early days the corn was actually conveyed to a bucket conveyor via a worm drive, and that kept it going at a Pacific speed, and that conveyed it up to the millstones, which incidentally were French burrstone and were second hand when the mill started. Before 1900 they were second hand stones, and when the mill closed in 1966 they were still the same stones, and they had worn about 1/4 of an inch in that time. But that's jumping forward a little bit, and the process then of grinding with water, the water from the 4 Mile Creek that had been treated to take out impurities, was added to the corn and was ground and became a slurry, and the slurry was then screened. There was 2 sets of sieves that did the screening. There was one set, a top set, that was actually a timber frame screen that had brass gauze in it, and the action, it had a rotary action at one end and a swing action at the other. That stopped the screen from getting clogged up, and this first screen used to sieve out all of the husk and the coarse material. What went through that screen then went to a stainless steel screen that in the early days had extremely fine silk mesh, and later days then became the same mesh in nylon. The silk didn't last as long as what the nylon did, and so the nylon was used when that material became available. It was an extremely fine nylon. Matter of fact, after the mill closed, there was some of the nylon was left over, and it was used to make a petticoat for my daughter Debbie. My wife Esme made a petticoat for my daughter Debbie, and it made a very good job of it. But that fine screen, what went through that then was the corn flour and the fine particles of protein. In the early days, that was then taken or piped to what we used to call the troughs, or runs we used to call them. They were a long trough. They were about 100 feet long. They were about 3 foot wide, or thereabouts, so about that wide. And there was a distribution head across the top of them, and so that the flow was even to each, because there was about 6 of those runs, and the liquid used to just gradually flow down those runs. There was a very slight slope on the runs, and the liquid flowed down those runs. The corn flour then settled to the bottom of there, and the tailings of liquid took the fine proteins over the end. We then had a second set of runs that ran the other way and shorter, that those tailings then went onto, and they were almost flat so that we had another chance of recovering later the corn flour that had actually gone over the end of those first runs. It was done in batches, and when that process had finished and the corn flour would form a cake on these long runs, at the top probably about 9 inches, I don't know what that is in metric, but it's about that far, about that deep, and of course gradually tapered down to nothing at the end. It was all then manually shovelled up with obviously very clean shovels, and people wore rubber gum boots that had been washed and all that. It was shovelled up and then went through a breaker that actually broke it into little pieces about roughly that big round. It was a pair of drums that had spikes on them, like nails that stuck up a little bit, and it just grated and broke those pieces to pieces, and then went on to steel trays. In the very early days, the trays, that actually, instead of being put on steel trays, was actually put onto canvas trays inside of a steam heated room, and that was the process. But in later years, my dad actually designed and built some electric kilns, and the steel trays were put into these kilns, and the corn flour was dried. From there, it was taken to a pulverizer that actually just bashed it into fine pieces, and then went through another rotary silk screen lined drum that rotated, and once it was finer again than the original liquid screen, and then the corn flour actually had to pass through that material, and of course from then it was just either packed off in bags, big bags of about 180 pounds in weight, and I'm saying pounds because in those days it was in pounds, and that's what I have to refer to, or it was packed off into packets for the retail market. And the corn flour was known as Paisley corn flour. The word Paisley derived from Scotland. It was a worldwide, well-known area for a good quality corn flour, and so the name Paisley was chosen. And it was always known, the tag name was Paisley the best corn flour. And I've still got a bag with a corn bag with the wording Paisley the best corn flour written on it, and the stencil with Paisley the best on it as well. Yes, well, during this period, obviously, nothing is static and things are changing the whole time, and the troughs or runs, as I was mentioning before, were originally made from beech, and they were replaced with concrete runs of the same dimensions. And the concrete, that would have been done in about the middle 50s, to my recollection. It might have been early 50s, but it was in the early to middle 50s. And they did the same kind of job. In the late 50s, early 60s, there were some changes made to the process, where instead of using the runs, which took a lot of time before you got product out of the end, and a lot of labour involved in carrying it out, the liquid from the bottom screen was then taken into a tank and fed to a de larval centrifuge, very similar to a milk separator, except that the bowl had nozzles in it and the disc arrangement inside of it was a little bit different, and it was much larger than a normal milk separator. And what it did was what the runs did. It separated the corn flour from the fine proteins. The fine proteins came out as the effluent, and the concentrated corn flour came out the nozzles in the centrifuge, and were then sent to a larger centrifuge, like a sugar centrifuge. They were actually purchased second-hand when the rice starch mill in Griffith closed down, and we bought the centrifuge from there. And that concentrated liquid was then fed into the centrifuge, and you got a solid material. It was done batch-wise. You got a solid material inside the basket, and then there was a plough that actually ploughed that solid material out of the basket through a hole in the centre at the bottom, and fed into, instead of having the trays and the electric kiln, were fed into an oil-fired, what we called a ring dryer. It was actually a combination design that my dad designed, William Francis, and it was between a ring dryer and a flash dryer. A flash dryer, normally it was fed into a vertical tube, and the material stayed in the tube until it got light enough when it was dry to go over the top. A ring dryer, it was taken around a circle, and in the time taken to go around the circle was considered to be dry. What he did was use the ring idea and then straight into a flash drying tube, and then into cyclones too, and that's where the dry material was collected and then fed automatically into the same kind of silk screen rotary screen that I mentioned before, and then off into either bulk or to packets for the retail market. In the mid-50s was when the Lawnton starch was actually developed, the early to middle 50s. It wasn't a product, they never made laundry starch in the early days, it was only purely corn flour. And the laundry starch was basically the corn flour, and then it was put into another process where the pH was actually raised. There were a couple of chemicals added to it, but most of the difference was in the raising of the pH. And then it was put down another set of runs and dried. It was cut into cakes, put into these trays and dried, because you were looking for a crystalline structure. The crystalline structure would dissolve much more easily and readily when the housewife was making her laundry starch, and therefore you didn't get lumps, and lumps were the things that made the blobs on your shirts. So that's basically how they made the laundry starch. But as I said, the process developed. The paper mill came into the district, and they had a need for industrial starches, and mainly in the form of corn flour, but some of them modified. And because they were so close to us, we didn't need to dry those. So we actually built a tanker on the back of an old Army Chev Blitz truck, and we used to deliver about 800 gallons at a time of liquid corn flour over to the paper mill. We also made some other starch-derived additives that had monogluconates added to it, and that was a stabilising material that the paper mill used. So we had some input into the actual big paper mill that came into the district and became the big industry for the district instead of us. The mill when it went to supplying the paper mill, because the quantity that was needed was much greater, and we gradually went into a 3-shift operation, and then 3-shift operation 7 days a week. We were, when the mill closed, we were milling 120 tonnes of corn a week, and our capacity, we used to produce about half a tonne an hour of dry material. So, you know, we had quite a bit of throughput at the end. The mill actually closed in May 1966. There were a few factors in it. The initial factors were that we'd had 2 years of drought. We had covered ourselves by having contracts with growers. We actually paid them. The average price of corn at that time was about 12 and sixpence. We gave them a contract for 14 shillings a bushel, and so in the good times we paid them 14 shillings a bushel. In the 2 years of drought, from 1964 to 66, the drought was in the corn growing areas. Even though we had contracts with the farmers, we would go to the area and there seemed to be a reasonable crop there, and then you'd go up there in a fortnight's time and there was no crop there, but the farmer said, "I know I harvested it, but there was nothing, I got nothing out of it." Well, we do know that the price of corn had gone to £2, 2 shillings, and we were having to actually pay that kind of money rather than just paying our 14 shillings that we had done our costings on. So that ate into our reserves in a big way, particularly when you think that you're milling 120 tonnes a week. It's a lot of money that was involved. And then there was a dispute with the APM, which put the close to the doors in May 1966. In hindsight, the dispute with the paper mill was actually paid out to our receivers, but that didn't help us very much. So yes, it was a milestone for the area for a lot of times. When the cornflour mill closed, I was actually approached by another starch company, cornflour company, and initially it was to build and commission a starch plant, a cornflour plant in Western Australia for them. I had to go to Sydney for 3 months to do commissioning on how they did things, because obviously different companies do things different ways, and so I did that. And one of the things that happened was that they at one stage gave me the engineer's plans for stage 1 of the process that they had planned for the Western Australian plant, and they asked me what I thought of it, and I said, well, I don't think it's very good. And they said, why? Most surprisingly. And I said, well, it's too complicated and you haven't got enough control. I said, if you just did this, this and this, and you'd use less pipes, less pumps, and you got better control. And they said, oh, okay. So then they brought me the drawings for stage 2, and they said, well, what do you think of this one? I said, the same thing. You haven't thought about it enough, And anyway, they said, well, look, how would you feel about designing the whole mill for us? And so that's what I did. I designed the mill for them and then went over and built it and commissioned it. And that was from 1966 to 68. My wife Esme and my son Paul and daughter Debbie all went to Western Australia for 2 years, and we had a good time. It was a lot of hard work. It was a lovely area over there, but the opportunity I'd done what I had to do, and the opportunity was there to come back to Queensland, to where all our friends and family were, and so we took that opportunity and moved back and took up a selling job, which I'd always wanted to sell. My dad always saw my expertise in the manufacturing side of things, but I always had a deep down yearning that I wanted to sell, and he was of the opinion that you could get anyone to sell, but not anybody could manufacture. So anyway, I went into selling. Make a long story short, and I actually went to work for Bostitch, the stapling and nailing machine people. And I spent 11.5 years with them. I ended up as Queensland manager. And while I was Queensland manager, we took off the award for the best results in, or the best state results, and that was measured in the normal things. I then had the opportunity to go and work for one of our customers, which was Tri-Wall Containers, who did heavy duty packaging, as a rep again, but for more money than what I was getting as manager for Bostitch. And I talked a lot for quite some time with my wife Esme about whether we should or whether we shouldn't make the move, because I was kind of thinking I'd spend the rest of my days at Bostitch. But they kept on increasing the amount of money, so we eventually took the job. And I spent a couple of years with Tri-Wall before the Visiboard group actually took them over. And then I spent the next 18.5 years with the Visiboard group at Designer Packaging, selling and designing heavy duty packaging. The last big job I did with them was they had a customer who came to us and said he exported sides of beef, and they used to get flown to Japan. The aluminium air cargo containers that we used to transport the size of beef to Japan were just stacking up on the Japanese airport because they wouldn't send them back empty. It would mean that there was nothing in that part of the plane. So they eventually said to the people, look, we'll transport your sides of beef, but you've got to supply your own disposable containers. And that's where they called me in. They asked me to design something that was a single trip container to transport sides of beef. I asked them what kind of weight they wanted to put in each container, and they told me 1.4 tonnes. So I made a cardboard container. It took me about 3 months to design it, but I made a cardboard container, and I believe it's still in operation. They're still using my design at the moment. I left Designer Packaging to Visiboard, and I actually planned to retire. And when I came home from my retirement, my son rang me up and said, I want to see you tomorrow morning. And I thought that was very nice. He's going to wish me all the best for retirement. And he came in the front door and he's got a little parcel in his hand. I thought, the silly bugger, he's gone and bought me something. I didn't want that. Just wishing me all the best would have been enough. So he gives me this parcel and I open it up, and it's a parcel of business cards. He owned a computer company, and he said, you're coming to work for me. And so I've just spent the last 3 years with my son for his computer company. He's restructured the computer company, and now I've just started retirement again. So that's most of my life story. As I said before, my wife's name is Esme, and my son's Paul and daughter Debbie. Paul has a son now, David. He's married to Karen, and Paul is married to Karen. Has a son, David, and Debbie is married to Scott Stoddard, and there are 2 grandchildren there, aged 12 and 8, and we have much pleasure in having the grandchildren here, and also following their careers and and their sailing. They sail Sabo sailboats, and they do extremely well at it, and we're very, very proud of them. Ryan started sailing when he was about 7. When he was 9, he made the Queensland team. We took him to Tasmania to compete in the national championships, and he's continued to follow those national championships and get awards in his own area. And so has Ashley, who's now taken up sailing as well, his little sister. Matter of fact, last December she sailed in the Sabo Week national titles. It was 6 races, 6 wins. And, that was a magnificent result. So obviously I'm very, very proud of all my grandchildren, and that's about me.